There are mountains that warn you from a distance, jagged silhouettes with obvious malice etched into their faces, and then there is one that hides its teeth. Rising to 7,134 meters, a broad-backed giant on the rim of Central Asia, it stretches out like a sleeping whale in ice. From certain angles the slopes look gentle, almost welcoming, a continuous ridge unspooling toward the sky, rather than a single spear thrust into it. Routes spread across its mass like threads on a loom, far more than a typical high peak, so many that climbers sometimes call it forgiving. They are not the first to mistake breadth for mercy. In the maps of empires and in the mouths of different languages, the mountain has worn several names across the last century. What never changed was its pull. During the Soviet era, when crossing borders could be as difficult as crossing crevasses, this summit became the proving ground, a high place you could reach, train on, and brag about. The camps stamped into its northern approach turned into small villages each summer, canvas neighborhoods with their own gossip, rituals, and unwritten laws. You could spend weeks shuttling between base camp and higher camps, getting used to thin air, trying out gear, and eyeing the weather like a suspicious neighbor. The season of 1990 opened like so many others. Teams from different clubs arrived with plans that pointed beyond this mountain to higher ambitions. Some of the strongest climbers in the Union were there to fine-tune themselves for future Himalayan attempts. The classic line up the north face, glacier approach, a curving traverse, then a long ridge to the summit, was beloved precisely because it resembled the architecture of the world's highest mountains in miniature. It allowed you to train the right muscles, test oxygen routines, and rehearse every ritual of a major ascent without the same degree of risk, or so many believed. The first big camp that felt truly on the mountain had a sun-baked nickname, the Frying Pan, a broad shelf around 5,300 meters where tents could sit neatly in rows. It basked in light on calm days and felt absurdly pleasant for such altitude. Veteran climbers swore that avalanches rarely touched it. The geography seemed to shield it from the worst. If you flipped through old diaries from the 60s and 70s, you'd find the same notes scribbled over and over. Good site, safe site, solid snow. Safety, once repeated enough times, turns into a lullaby. Early July, the caravan began to move upward. The mountain wore a fresh veil, late snow from a stubborn storm, and the first day's rhythm turned into shoveling, waiting, and rechecking forecasts. When the clouds finally thinned, dozens of climbers shouldered loads and wound their way to the shelf, making camp on that familiar apron of white. A legendary alpinist, one of the few Soviets who had stood atop the tallest peaks on Earth, reached the camp, frowned at the feel of the snow under his boots, and turned back to base to sleep on a bad gut. Experience is a weather report of its own. Evening fell without drama. Stoves simmered. Dried soups thickened inside metal cups. People told the same jokes that get told in every high camp, the kind that make you feel like a local in a place where no one is local. Then the light slid off the ridges and the white turned blue. If you could freeze that moment, the camp would look like a monastery at Vespers, quiet, orderly, pious in its small routines. The mountain had other prayers in mind. Far away, deep within the Hindu Kush, the earth flinched. No one in the tents felt it. Snow feels nothing until it feels everything. Somewhere above the Frying Pan, a serac, an ice tower embedded in the mountain's flank, fractured. It does not take much. A tiny change in stress, a whisper of vibration, a burden of new snow laid on old. The block went, and in going, it brushed a slope already heavy with powder. The slope let go. What began as a single bite of ice cascaded into a white tide hundreds of meters wide, a river of air and crystals that moves faster than panic and louder than language. The avalanche roared down in seconds. Tents are like thoughts in such a wave, fragile, bright, and instantly overturned. When silence returned, it was the kind of silence that makes sound feel like blasphemy. Two men who had been tented near the edge of the platform survived not because the mountain spared them, but because it flung them away, tumbling along the slope, ripped out of nylon like seeds in a gale. They fell and slid and fell again, a long, brutal descent that ended in a heap of snow and luck. Climbing teaches you 1,000 micro skills. Survival sometimes demands only one: continue. They clawed themselves upright, half-dressed, bleeding, stunned, and saw the slope above like a white ceiling. In that first minute, they were not heroes. They were animals, sniffing for warmth. A body protruded from the snow, lifeless. Another friend lay half-buried and gasping. The two dug him free, then realized the new physics of this place. Anything heavy had sunk. Anything light lay scattered on the surface. Stoves, cylinders, human bodies, down below, locked in a freezing matrix. Scraps of clothing and torn tent fly, up top loose, fluttering, reachable. The living wrapped themselves in what the wind had spared. Night at altitude is not a color. It is weight. The two survivors huddled under scavenged fabric and became a shape that could endure until dawn. Above there were voices, muted, intermittent, pleading. Beneath meters of consolidated powder, a sleeping bag can prolong body heat but not breath. The men listened, then stopped listening because listening did nothing but stain the brain with a sound it cannot use. Their duty, they decided, was not to die. Sometimes the only rescue you can offer is testimony. Morning arrived like a guess. Fog swelled across the slope, flattening depth, erasing edges. The two started down, tossing snowballs ahead to hear them land. Soft thuds when the ground was near, a swallowed echo when it wasn't. One limped with a broken bone, the other could hardly feel his feet. And yet they moved. The will to drink a glass of lemonade in a world where lemons cannot grow is absurd. Absurdities built the pyramids and have saved more lives than reason. By late day, a rescue party working up from base camp intercepted one of the men and pulled him into wool, into warmth, into the reality of help. Helicopters came, and with them the strange choreography of post-disaster. Probing poles, shovels, the calculus of where a body might be in a slope, hardened overnight into ice. The frying pan had become a single fused plate. They recovered a few. Most were beyond human reach until the glacier itself decided to give them back, years later, in slow disclosures of bone and cloth. If you were to ask the mountain what happened, it would answer with a shrug of physics. A serac fell, a slab slid, the mass moved. But that is not a story. A story requires people, decisions, a string you can follow with your fingers. The string of that night leads to a cruel conclusion. Risk does not disappear when you spread it out across many routes or share it among many climbers. Risk multiplies with presence. A safe mountain crowded with ambition is not a refuge. It is a statistic waiting for weather. Disaster has a theatre, and avalanches own the marquee. But the high places also claim lives in ways that do not thunder. Years after the Great Slide, two friends stepped onto the same mountain in late summer with ordinary plans. They were not chasing a record or a headline. They were chasing the small private glow you get from hard effort done well. A guide who knew the mountain like the back of his wind-burned hand agreed to show them the rhythm of the route. Leave early, move steady, eat when you're not hungry, drink when you forget you're thirsty. One of the two injured his knee on the approach and turned back limping toward camp a little angry, but convinced he'd done the adult thing. The other pressed upward with the guide, traversing toward a higher shelter as weather moved in with that particular mountain mood. Not violent at first, just insistent. By the time they crawled into their tent, they were soaked and shivering, classic precursors to bad decisions. If you have never waited out a storm in a high camp tent, you might imagine music and cards. What it often becomes is counting the seconds between gusts, counting the times you tell yourself you're fine, counting how many sips of fuel you have left in the burner, how many minutes until the water boils, how many cracks in the tent fabric you can see if you point your headlamp up. You make tea because tea is a small victory against a big world. You crack the door to keep the flame polite. You assume that the gap you left is enough. Snow lies. It creeps up against fabric from the outside and packs itself into the very space you created for safety. If a vent clogs, the arithmetic of a tent shifts from oxygen in and CO2 out to a dead exchange. A small stove blooms a gas you cannot smell. Your brain misreads the lull as comfort. The famous warning, never cook in the tent, competes with the equally famous reality of storms that make rules feel theoretical. The next people to open the flap find a silence that is easy to misinterpret. It looks like sleep. It is sleep's counterfeit. That quiet end is how many high-altitude tragedies become invisible to history. You will not find them in cartoons of white fangs and howling wind. You find them in the margins of logbooks and the conversations of friends months later. When telling the story as a way to keep a promise to the dead, we will say your name, we will say why. The lesson is not do not climb, nor is it obey every rule like scripture, because mountains glean their power from contexts that shift under your boots. The lesson is attentiveness. A tent is a good servant and a bad master. In its thin wall lives the most literal definition of atmosphere. To stay alive up there is to develop the habit of checking even the things you already checked. In the death zone, boredom is a tool. Nothing to do, so do the checklist again. If you turn the pages back further, to a year when Cold War lines were drawn on everything from maps to mines, the mountain hosted a carnival of rope. Teams arrived from everywhere, Americans and Scots, Japanese climbers with precise knots, French with cigarettes and jokes so dry they could be used as tinder, and an enormous Soviet presence buzzing with organization. Never had base camp looked so cosmopolitan. The stream that separated one cluster of tents from another might as well have been a border, yet people crossed it constantly, trading gossip about routes and commenting on the same clouds in different languages. In that wide gathering, an all-women Soviet team drew a magnetic circle. Their leader was a woman who had earned a title that meant more than a certificate. It meant she did hard things repeatedly while the system watched. She had led traverses in the Caucasus that looked like something cut from a legend and told in kitchens. She had the crisp tone of someone used to being heard the first time. She wanted not merely to go up the mountain, but across it, up one side, and down the other, an elegant line that would require endurance rather than wizardry, a test of resolve more than one of missing fingers. Weather writes its own speeches, and that particular July it chose to be eloquent. More snow than usual, more grumbling in the earth, more small avalanches that licked at camp edges without fully swallowing them. On one day, an American party watched a powder slide run down the slope above, burying gear, flipping bodies into the very crevasse they would later credit for saving their lives. Recovery efforts took hours and were punctuated by the grim quiet that follows the last shove of a shovel. Elsewhere, a separate group met a worse fate, their story collapsing into a line in a log, 3 lost. There are times when reason argues for retreat, and times when momentum argues louder. Money had been spent, schedules had been drawn up, reputations had been attached to outcomes. Radios bridged some of the gaps between groups, but not all of them. Frequencies didn't match. Customs officers in one place had taken devices from another. The human chain of messages was frayed. Warnings at base did not always become warnings on the ridge. At the end of July, the women set off on a less common line, the Lipkin route, an arc that would suit their plan to descend by another way. Camp 3 became a staging area where the mountain looked deceptively close. Across the final stretch, the summit plateau rolled like a white highway. Long, not steep, a trap disguised as a favor. In deep snow, a walk becomes a march through memory foam that steals your strength a few centimeters at a time. Another team of women from Europe started their own push, amid murmurs in camp. Maybe wait one more day, maybe let the weather settle into a definition. They climbed anyway, because climbers climb and because a window can look bigger from inside a tent than it looks on the face of the peak. Then the storm hit with theater. Midday dimmed as if someone had turned a dial. Those on the upper ridge felt the world shrink to the circle of visibility around their foreheads. One of the Europeans staggered in the white and stumbled into an American who had just abandoned his attempt. He became a lighthouse. He turned her around. On their descent, they met her friends heading up, faces set in that determined line that says, "We will be the exception." Most exceptions are written by weather, not by people. Somewhere above, the Soviet women pressed on. Other parties lower on the same route huddled or retreated, or argued with themselves and then retreated. Between gusts, a radio carried an instruction from a giant of Soviet mountaineering down at base. Go no higher. The mountain has spoken. Radios are only useful when they are in your tent and when the air cooperates. Up on the ridge, words fought the wind and lost. Night at altitude steals contours. The ridge blurred into sky, tents into drifting shapes. The women reported they were close, so close. Then their voices began to fray, the way voices do when cold colonizes not just fingers, but judgment. They spoke of light, any light, even the false kind that snow makes when it reflects itself. They spoke to other teams on the net, and then the net thinned. The storm, having swallowed the summit, began to eat the slopes below, and every plan became a version of stay alive until morning. Base camp woke to a new math. How many in each party? Where were they last? Who had heard who? Search teams moved upward. Hellis did what they could between gusts, banking away from spindrift that looked like smoke. Reports trickled down in the slow rhythm that always follows a whiteout. By then the mountain was a book with several endings. Some parties descended on their own, staggered, frost-burned, speaking in short sentences like people who had spent a while not hearing any. Others did not descend at all. What makes the Soviet women's attempt so haunting is what it represented beyond a single climb. It was a statement about capability, about leadership, about a line drawn by women across a space that had so often been a stage for men. Every lost climber is a person first, a symbol last. Yet symbols murmur after the bodies are flown home. The names carved into stones at the mountain's foot tell a simple truth dressed in complicated clothes. Ambition is noble, the weather is indifferent. Avalanche debris does not behave like the snow that falls on your porch. The wave churns air into the mass. Then time and cold press that foam into concrete. Digging can become chiseling. Minutes save lives becomes a cruel joke when the slab has cured overnight. In the days after the great slide at the frying pan, rescuers traced arcs over the slope like archaeologists, probing for voids, interpreting the angle of a tent pole trapped in blue ice as if it were hieroglyph. They brought out a few. Most stayed where they lay. Glaciers are patient archivists. They keep what we lose and index it in the quiet. Years later, when summer bit deeper and ice retreated, the mountain began returning its stored items. A glove with stitching still intact, an ice tool whose shaft carried the hand memory of the person who had swung it, fragments of nylon that once made rooms for laughter. Some of the bodies emerged in startling preservation, faces thin as bark, clothing still shouting the colors of older decades. Families flew in from cities whose names the mountain could not pronounce. A son of a lost climber stood on the same shelf that had been a dining room of tents and became a guide to grief, pointing out where things had been, where people had slept, where he had first understood that hope can be both holy and dangerous. When the living return to a place of loss, they come to address two arguments at once. The first is with geography. You were the last to see them. Give them back. The second is with memory. Tell me the final sentences of a story we never got to finish. Sometimes the mountain yields and bones ride down on stretchers, and the rituals that were stolen by weather are restored by hands. More often the mountain does what mountains are famous for doing. It remains. The tally from that single night is still a choke in the throat of climbing history, the largest number of lives taken in one expeditionary moment. It altered how people talk about safe peaks. It reminded planners that route variety is not a synonym for guarantee, that a shelf blessed by long quiet years can still be within the reach of one bad convergence. Fresh snow, a weakness in ice, a rumble deep in rock. The frying pan was not cursed, it was geophysical. That is perhaps the hardest kind of truth to live with. There is no villain you can curse except chance. Down in the towns, memorial stones gather names like libraries collect titles. Some of those names carry club affiliations from Leningrad. Others carry nationalities from far beyond the borders. Many will never have a complete accounting. DNA uncollected, objects unrecovered, last words unknown. The people who climb there today pass those stones on the way to sign-in tents and gear checks. They step into harnesses, while the wind murmurs through the same prayer flags that watched their predecessors' shoulder packs. If the mountain teaches anything, it is that remembrance is not a place you visit once. It is a stance. After the headlines fade, and the documentaries hum in the background of our streaming services, the mountain remains a physical question posed to each new generation. Knowing all this, why climb at all? Some answers are straightforward. The joy of movement in cold, clear air, the friendship that arises when a rope makes two bodies into one animal, the view from a ridge when the planets seem closer than the valley, the discipline that makes life elsewhere feel both calmer and more vivid. Other answers are less noble but equally human: ambition. The desire to lay a line on a map with your own feet, the wish to master what cannot be mastered. The truth that hovers above them all is not mystical, it is statistical. More people on a mountain, even a comparatively moderate one, create more exposures. One season's easy weather is a seduction that whispers to the next season's crowds. Risk is an economy with compounding interest. Those who come to this peak now read route descriptions that include hard-won clarifications. Camp placements revised a few hundred meters this way or that, warnings about serac bands that look stable until they aren't, footnotes about stove use in storms that sound nitpicky until you stand in blowing white, and realize that a rule is sometimes a memory carved into grammar. The disasters on this mountain, loud and quiet, do not amount to a verdict against climbing. They argue for humility. The most experienced climber in the valley can wake up with a feeling in his ribs and decide to go down. The strongest young climber can dislocate a knee on a simple approach and choose to turn around, saving others a future nightmare. Teams can rehearse radio protocol as if it were a summit technique and treat information as food. A tent flap can be checked even when you had rather not move your hands from their cocoon. None of these habits will ever produce a promise, but they will add threads to a net that has already saved more lives than we will ever count. The mountain has been renamed more than once, and will likely be renamed again in the minds of those who climb it. To some, it will always be a classroom. To others, a cemetery. To others, a mirror held up to the parts of themselves they prefer to ignore in the valley. On summer mornings, when the glacier wakes in a lacework of new streams and small avalanches grumble on distant faces, a climber can look up and feel both invited and warned. That is exactly the right feeling to have. When people call this the deadliest expedition in mountaineering history, they are referring to a single event. But together, the stories from this peak form a larger sentence. The difference between safe and safer is not grammar. It is vigilance, practiced in boredom under a sky that will never care. And still, people go back. They clip rope to rope, shoulder weight, and walk upward into weather because that is what our species does when a horizon raises its eyebrows. We tell ourselves that this time we will read the signs better. Sometimes we do. Sometimes the glacier tells us the rest years later. Viewer discretion is advised. This is a dramatized documentary narrative based on historical events. Some details are reconstructed for clarity.